Welcome, friends, to the APUSH Dig. Our topic for this week is the American Revolution. As always here at the APUSH Dig, we are concerned with studying how things change in history. So how much of a change in world history was the American Revolution? Or in other words, how revolutionary was the American Revolution? I like to separate the colonial historical era and the revolutionary era. And the break between the two is the conflict between France and Britain, and between colonists and indigenous peoples. This conflict we refer to as the French and Indian War. We need to understand that the competition among the British, French, and American Indians for economic and political issues in North America created this conflict, in which Britain defeated France and its allied American Indians. In the 1700s, British settlers continued pushing westward and crossed the Appalachian Mountains and trespassed into indigenous land in the Ohio River Valley. This land was claimed by France, and these incursions led to open warfare. The British and the colonists on one side, the French and their indigenous allies on the other. This French and Indian War, known globally as the 7 Years' War, ended with British victory and the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Under the Treaty of Paris, France ceded its claims to land east of the Mississippi River in North America. This now becomes another major expansion of the British Empire. This left the indigenous tribes of the region without any allies to stand against further settler incursions into their territory. Winning the war against France came at great financial expense to the British, which was left in major debt. Not only did the British government now want to seek new means to raise funds, it also wanted to consolidate its global empire by limiting its costs. One cost it could limit would be in the newly acquired lands in North America. Rather than having to pay to station troops in the Ohio River Valley to protect its land-hungry settler colonists, who would surely have major conflict with the indigenous peoples there, the King and Parliament created the Proclamation of 1763. The colonists would have the land east of the Appalachian Mountains. Native Americans would have the land west of the mountains. This extremely angered the colonists for many reasons. One is they felt they were entitled to be able to settle in these newly won western lands. Many wealthy colonists, like George Washington, had already arranged purchases of land there, and they were planning on selling this land at greatly inflated prices. But what angered the colonists the most was what was implied by the proclamation. It said that the native peoples west of the mountains were now subjects of the global British Empire, and therefore had a right to their land. This meant that the colonists and the native peoples were now both British subjects. The settlers had always viewed themselves as superior to the native peoples, who they decried as savages and heathens. Now they were political equals in the eyes of Parliament. These settlers would never accept that. This new erupting resentment would lead to the Revolutionary Era. The desire of many colonists to assert ideals of self-government in the face of renewed British imperial efforts led to a colonial independence movement and war with Britain, the American Revolution. British efforts to collect taxes without direct colonial representation or consent, and to assert imperial authority in the colonies, began to unite the colonists against perceived and real constraints on their economic activities and their political rights. Taxes and laws such as the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act, and the Tea Act incensed some colonists. These colonists became the leaders of the Patriot movement for independence, or self-rule. Other colonists remained loyalists, opposed to the independence movement. The famous protest slogan here was "No taxation without representation." But to the Patriot leaders, the problem went beyond just taxation. It was about legislation without representation. The colonists had a history of governing themselves, and they greatly resented the authoritarian measures being taken by the King and Parliament ever since the French and Indian War ended in 1763. No colonist served as a member of Parliament, therefore Parliament had no right to pass legislation in the colonies. This is what the Patriots believed. The Patriots based their revolt on the idea that their rights as British subjects had been violated by London. Further, using Enlightenment-influenced language, they cried that their natural rights as individuals had been desecrated. Pamphlets like Common Sense by Thomas Paine and the presenting of the Declaration of Independence in 1776 itself persuaded more and more colonists to join the Patriot movement for self-rule, for independence from Britain, for the creation of the United States of America. Regional conflict grew into all-out war across all 13 colonies. Against all odds, the Patriot Rebellion succeeded. It succeeded despite loyalist opposition. It succeeded despite Britain's military and financial advantages. The Patriot cause, the cause for independence, succeeded because of the actions of colonial militias, the Continental Army, led by George Washington, and also it succeeded thanks to the colonists' ideological commitment to the revolutionary ideas. But most importantly, it succeeded because the movement was assisted by European allies, most importantly, France. Without French help, there would have been no victory in the revolution. So finally, let's reflect on change during the revolutionary time period. Let's look at it in two different ways. What was revolutionary about the American Revolution? And also, what was not revolutionary about the American Revolution? First off, what was revolutionary? The revolutionary aspect of the revolution is it was a revolt against a royal imperial power. And the revolt was driven by the language of natural rights and popular sovereignty, that the colonists should be their own governance. After the victory, the Americans will not replicate the British governance structure and instead experiment with republicanism. Now, it was never a democracy, but there were some democratic aspects that we'll talk about in future weeks. What was not revolutionary about the American Revolution? Well, slavery continues, and it expands into new southwestern territory. The same elite colonists who held the most influence and power before the revolution become the political leaders after the revolution. Many revolutions in world history are often led by the lower classes, the masses of workers going against the social structure of the time. However, in the American Revolution, what's unique is that the leaders of the revolution were actually the upper classes. Names like Jefferson and Franklin and Washington, they were the bourgeoisie. And so in a sense, the American Revolution is a very bourgeois revolution. And with all of its rhetoric of rights, women, black people, and the mass of working people do not experience any immediate change in the new American society, right? So language like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that is so important in our Declaration of Independence, what did it mean for women? What did it mean for black people? It didn't mean anything for slaves. And working people, people without land, they weren't even allowed to vote in the new American society. So these are some examples of what was not revolutionary about the American Revolution. We'll talk more next week.